When we ask the question of the fate of the princes in the Tower, the discussion usually revolves around the possible guilt of Richard III. Did he have his nephews Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury killed? The identical and quite weighty arguments are always put forward against the uncle. He had the princes brought to the Tower of London. The fortress was under his command. On sight, his confidants acted to protect Richard's interests, whatever they may have been. Only he had guaranteed access and could therefore decide their fate. However, we know for certain that the last point is not true. Dominic Mancini, who was in England in the service of France, informs us from the Tower, citing the doctor John Argentine. Mancini, as a spy for the so-called universal spider Louis the 11th, thus had at least one contact with access to the Tower. Even if we do not know how far-reaching the connections of the Italian monk in the service of the French crown actually reached in the fortress, it remains to be said, the Tower of London was compromised by France. This potentially provides a source of information that has so far been criminally neglected. This can be good for Richard, but it doesn't have to be. Just to avoid confusion, Mancini was sent to England by a man named Angelo Cato. However, he worked directly for the French king. He had been on the monarch's personal payroll since 1481 and received the considerable annual salary of 1925 livres. Welcome back to Lemmy History. I announced some time ago that I was looking into a potential solution to the mystery of the princes in the Tower. Today, I would like to show in which direction my work is going. I will not present final results, as I still have archive visits ahead of me, as also announced. However, I thought it was right to share some thoughts and insights. Argentine is the only name Mancini mentions as a contact. Another informant named today is Pietro Carmeliano, who worked in the Rolls house but also had direct contacts with Edward V. Annette Carson, for example, assumes that the Italian provided his compatriot with the law firm records that Mancini occasionally speaks of. The fact that only one name is mentioned is of considerable importance. Mancini published his account of the usurpation of Richard III in December 1484. It was safe to assume that the English king would receive it. He knew that the person in question had spoken to a French spy. In Argentine's case, this was particularly explosive, as he said that Edward V repented daily and expected imminent death. After the publication, the doctor had no future in England as long as Richard was in power. It is speculation, but the thought suggests itself that the York king must have regarded Argentine's behavior as a betrayal and would have punished accordingly if he had had access to the doctor. We know that nothing happened to him. Argentine later became a physician to Prince Arthur and provost at Cambridge University. What we can't say is what Richards did for the rest of the reign. In the past, it has been repeatedly suggested that he fled to France. However, this was mostly speculated in connection with Henry Tudor, who was in exile in Brittany, precisely because he later made a career under him. It is more likely that he fled with Mancini's help to escape the consequences of his statements in his home country. And here, we can already see that France was potentially more than just an observer. Perhaps Argentine was taken out of the country in exchange for his name being mentioned. This is all very speculative, but it should show how worthwhile it is to take a closer look at France's activities. This is equally evident in examples that are undisputed. France was the first country to publicly accuse Richard of the murder of his nephews. This was done in January 1484 by the Lord Chancellor Guillaume de Rochefort. He was one of the men who had once worked for the Duke of Burgundy, but was later poached by Louis the 11th. He shared this background, for example, with Philippe de Comines and Mancini's client, Angelo Cato. This Cato lived in Paris in 1483, although he had become Archbishop of Vienne the previous year. During this time, he maintained a personal friendship with Guido de Rochefort, the Chancellor's brother. Cato was a guest at a series of gatherings known as the Literary Dinner, held at de Rochefort's residence. It was there that he also met the Chancellor. Another individual he befriended was Robert Gaguin. Gaguin had long served Louis the Eleventh, but failed in 1477 to prevent the marriage between Maximilian and Mary of Burgundy. From 1489, he was sent as an envoy to England. What he did between 1477 and 1483 remains unknown. However, Gaguin authored a history of France that extended up to the reign of Charles VIII. It received little attention overall. What is noteworthy for us is that the episode involving the princes in the Tower is entirely absent, though Gaguin does mention the death of George, Duke of Clarence, the brother of Edward IV, and Richard III, who was executed in 1478. We cannot draw definitive conclusions from this omission, but the absence is at least striking. Instead, Gaguin focused on Louis the Eleventh in 1483, who was visibly dying and had been seriously ill for years. His own son Charles was only months older than Edward V. Louis anticipated a turbulent regency for his underage heir. His daughter Anne and his son-in-law, Louis, Duke of Orleans, were already contending for power. The situation was thus not unlike that in England following the sudden illness and death of Edward IV. Louis feared the English king. In the past, he had already been accused of involvement in the death of the first York monarch, allegedly through poison. However, this is not the place to delve into that issue. More relevant for the moment is that Richard is said to have offered France his friendship after his coronation. Whether this was actually the case, we will discuss shortly, but the terminally ill Louis reportedly rejected the offer, allegedly due to the princes in the Tower. Cato was constantly near him and had by then ordered Mancini to return. One would expect that a weakened and uncertain France might seize the chance to reconcile with England, yet that did not occur. We frequently encounter many of the actors commonly associated with the fate of the princes in France. Bishop Robert Stillington, for instance, was sent to Brittany after the end of his chancellorship to negotiate the surrender of Henry Tudor to the English crown. As we know, the mission failed. Nevertheless, his stay brought him into contact not only with the Duke of Brittany, but also with Louis the Eleventh. From France, we learned that it was Stillington who informed Richard of Edward IV's alleged pre-contract with Eleanor Butler. Otherwise, we would not know the name. Naturally, this raises the question of how France came to know it when it was supposedly forgotten even in England. This must remain unanswered for now. A letter from Richard III to Stillington from 1471 has been preserved. This is unsurprising, given the positions both men held in Edward IV's government. However, it serves as an example that they were already acquainted well before 1483. Richard himself had been in France with the English army in 1475. James Tyrrell was part of his entourage. At that time, Comines had caught the interest of the French king. Still in the service of the Duke of Burgundy in 1470, Comines had met Richard and Edward during their exile. 2 years later, he joined Louis the Eleventh, and by 1475, he was a natural intermediary with the English. Apparently, he ensured that Louis and Richard remained in contact. A letter from Edward IV's brother leaves little doubt about this. Anne Sutton and Livia Visser-Fuchs describe in an essay published in the Ricardian that the letter was part of a diplomatic effort by Edward IV, which oscillated between alliances with Burgundy and France. That may be true, But it overlooks the fact that although Richard declined a pension from Louis in 1475, he accepted lavish gifts from the French king in Amiens. Louis and Richard held a private meeting, the content of which remains unknown. Presumably, they discussed Richard's resistance to the proposed peace treaty, but perhaps Henry Tudor was also a subject. Louis the Eleventh was no ally of the teenage exile. Tudor had a claim to the French crown through his grandmother, Catherine of Valois, a claim technically stronger than his claim to the English throne. Louis and Richard may have been considering how to persuade the Duke of Brittany to surrender Tudor. This theory aligns with the fact that shortly afterward, Stillington was tasked with negotiating precisely that. Whatever the truth may be, Louis knew Richard personally, understood his political importance, and maintained direct communication with him. It is therefore unsurprising that Richard wrote directly to Louis after his accession. In the letter, Richard refers to a prior letter from Louis, in which the French king had supposedly asked for his friendship, which Richard expressed willingness to accept. The letter also discusses the grievances of English merchants, whose goods had allegedly been confiscated by the French. What matters most here is that this correspondence represents a direct channel of communication, dating from the time of the prince's disappearance, a source that has been largely overlooked. When the French later reported that Richard had offered Louis friendship, it likely referred to this letter. The new English king did not explicitly make such an offer, but instead responded to a supposed request for friendship from Louis. It is worth considering whether Richard was aware of Louis's deteriorating health. The French king would die only 9 days later. Whether he even saw Richard's letter remains uncertain. Nonetheless, France later claimed that Louis had rejected Richard. From these fragments alone, it is evident that information concerning the princes was circulating within France soon after Richard's rise. It is tempting to think that the returning Mancini or Cato played a role in this. This leads us to the question of why Mancini was actually in England in the first place. Louis the Eleventh had already effectively terminated the marriage agreement between his son and Elizabeth of York in 1480. Instead, he arranged a union with Margaret of Austria, the daughter of Maximilian. Although Charles would eventually marry Anne of Brittany, by 1482, it had become clear to everyone in England that all the agreements made between Edward IV and Louis the Eleventh in 1475 had fallen apart. The French king feared retaliation from his English counterpart. Although Richard was at that time conducting a campaign against Scotland in his brother's name, it was nearing its end. Louis was no longer in a position to personally organize an effective defense, and his son was too young to take on such a responsibility. Louis therefore needed information. He wanted to understand how real the threat of war was. He also wished to gauge the general mood in England. This task fell to Cato, who in turn commissioned Mancini to carry out the mission. The choice of the monk was an interesting one, as he did not speak English. It is speculative, but one might reasonably assume that this language barrier served as a cover. His lack of English made him appear unlikely to be involved in espionage. Mancini spoke French and his native Italian. This nevertheless enabled him to communicate effectively with members of the social elite, who, almost without exception, could speak French. Many physicians also understood Italian. Argentine was one such figure. We possess printed materials on which he inscribed in Italian that they were his property. These stand as impressive evidence of his linguistic ability. Argentine met Cato during their time together in Ferrara. It can be assumed that Mancini came into contact with him through this acquaintance. There are several other connections worth highlighting that link Argentine to the events surrounding the princes in the Tower. First, he was at the University of Cambridge at the same time as Louis Caerleon, specifically in 1465 and 1466. It is plausible that the two men met during this period and remained in contact thereafter. Caerleon later served as the physician to both Elizabeth Woodville and Margaret Beaufort. In the summer of 1483, he acted as a courier, smuggling secret messages between the two women. Another royal physician of interest to us is Dominic de Cerigo. Originally from Venice, he was employed at the court of Edward IV beginning in 1466. He had arrived in England before 1461, after completing his studies in Italy. It was likely during this time in Italy that he first met Cato. De Cerigo had ties to Elizabeth Woodville's family even before her elevation to queen, and these connections secured him a place at court. Over time, his primary responsibility became the care of the king's daughters. For his exemplary service in this role, he received a financial reward of over £53 in 1475. Despite his position, de Cerigo struggled with financial difficulties throughout his life, which made him susceptible to external financial influences. He benefited from his contacts on the continent and received payments from Burgundy until the death of Charles the Bold. That year, 1477, also marks the last time he appears in English records. De Cerigo likely accompanied Edward, Richard, and Anthony Woodville to Burgundy in 1470. He was closely aligned with John Argentine, who had persuaded him to switch allegiance from the Lancastrians to the House of York. Argentine had earlier assisted Edward in his flight to Calais in 1459 and became a member of the Privy Council under the first York king, remaining loyal throughout. In 1475, he held supreme command of the English naval forces. It is notable that both Richard III and Henry VII would later place their trust in him. Argentine supported de Cerigo's rise. De Cerigo likely facilitated contact between the Woodvilles and Argentine. Between 1466 and 1473, Argentine was practically continuously present in Cambridge without any extended absence. After this period, however, his whereabouts become somewhat obscure, as Dennis E. Rhodes has demonstrated. Initially, his name was entered as Dean in an administrative record for the academic years 1473 and 1474, but it was later crossed out. Subsequently, we only catch brief glimpses of him in Cambridge, for instance, in August 1476, and again in the autumn of 1477. In 1478, Argentine appears to have been back for a longer stay, only to vanish from the sources once more for an extended time. In my view, however, this pattern is relatively straightforward to explain. The future Edward V was sent to Ludlow in 1473. In 1476, he was in Warwickshire under the supervision of his uncle George, and by 1477, he was in Windsor and London from August until the end of January 1478. During this period, he also attended the wedding of his younger brother, for example. In other words, Argentine reappears in the sources whenever Edward was not residing in Wales as Prince of Wales. The pattern is not entirely consistent, but I believe this can be accounted for by the doctor's periodic travels to Italy. Still, the overall data is sufficiently clear to reasonably conclude that Argentine was likely stationed in Ludlow with the heir to the throne. This would explain why his name was originally recorded as Dean and later struck out. He had to leave for Wales on short notice. Appropriately, Mancini refers to Argentine as Edward's personal physician, not as a physician to the broader royal family. The only Woodville Mancini speaks favorably of is Anthony, and Argentine would have worked under him for years, making him a particularly valuable informant. Here is where speculation enters once again. If my theory holds, Argentine was probably present at Stony Stratford. This would mean he witnessed firsthand how Richard seized control of Edward and arrested and removed his companions. Such an experience would help explain why he was willing to be named openly in Mancini's report. He was angry. I don't want to let today's presentation get out of hand. The aim of this video was to show just how much potentially useful information converged in France, information that could significantly aid our understanding. Naturally, this leads us to a provocative question. Could France itself have been responsible for the disappearance of the princes? This question becomes even more explosive when we learn that Cato had written a book for the King of Ferrara, detailing all known poisons and their corresponding antidotes. He later brought this work with him to France. We know this for certain, as the only surviving copy, dating from the 17th century, is held in Paris. Furthermore, Cato had access to royal physicians. In recent years, this has already sparked speculation that Argentine might have been responsible for the deaths of the princes in the Tower, and later also for that of Prince Arthur. However, in Arthur's case, it is relatively certain that the cause was sweating sickness, even if David Starkey argues for testicular cancer. Arthur's wife, Catherine of Aragon, exhibited the same symptoms but survived. For obvious reasons, testicular cancer can be ruled out in her case. Strategically speaking, France had more to gain from a weak England. A minority government riven by conflict between the Woodvilles and Richard would have better served the interests of Louis the Eleventh. But this was only the introductory video on this topic. More will follow later this year. Let me end with this thought. Angelo Cato wrote his own historical account of his time in Burgundy and at the court of Louis the Eleventh. Wouldn't it be wonderful if someone thinks he might have found it? Thanks for watching. As always, I appreciate your likes and subscriptions.